The graph of y equals g of x is the image of the graph of y equals f of x after a combination of transformations. So what we have is the original graph in red, and they've labeled 2 points A and B, and the new graph in blue, and they've labeled points A and B. And we need to find the equation in terms of the function f. So it's a working backwards question, like we did before. And what we did before is we said, well, let's take our 2 points. If I take A, which is 0, 8, and B, which is 2, -8, and I do my transformations, there'd be 2 sets of arrows, and we would end up with, on the blue graph, -2, 0, and 0, -8. And unlike the example that we did before, now that there's multiple things happening, it's a little bit trickier. Because you have to figure out, what do I multiply by and add to go from 0 to -2 and 2 to 0? And in the example we did in section 3.3, you could just see it right away. It was easy. Now it's a little bit more complicated. And so the method that we used as our second method in 3.3 is going to help us here. If you remember that method, what we did in that method is we first looked at the horizontal distances, and we looked on our original graph from A to B, and we looked at the image graph from A prime to B prime. So from A to B, I'm starting at 0, I'm going over 2, my horizontal distance is 2. From A prime to B prime, I start at -2, I go over to 0, is also 2. Has there been any multiplication? No. Technically, you multiplied x by 1. That won't change anything for multiplying your x values. However, when we look at our vertical distances, from A to B on our red graph, we are starting, A starts at +8, and we go down to -8. From A to B is down 16. So we put a negative sign because we're going down. From A prime to B prime, we start at 0, we go down to -8, we would go down -8. Has there been any multiplying here? Yes. How would I multiply from 16 to get to 8? The y values are getting multiplied by half. What this lets us figure out, okay, and as far as helping you look at this in your notes later, okay, I'm going to put a 1 here because this is what we did first, and figuring that out will allow us to right above here that y has to be multiplied by a half. So we did that work in 1 so that above that arrow, I can write y has to be multiplied by half. I don't have to write x by 1 because that's not going to change anything. So what I now can figure out is these points. I'll put a little 3 there to remind ourselves this is what we did as our third step. Because when you look at this later in your notes, you don't see the steps, right? You just see the arrows first, and you're like, how did I get that? Okay, we did this first to figure out that we had to multiply y by 2. Once I figured out that I'm multiplying y by half, that tells me my x's are not changing. This will change to 4, and this will change to -4. And now that I have those 2 points, this section is going to be easy. How do I go from 0 to -2 and 2 to 0? The only thing that makes sense is I'm going to left. How do I go from 4 to 0 and -4 to -8? I have to go 4 down. Once I figured out step 2, that y had to be multiplied by half, and I was able to write the points as we did in step 3 there, then it was easy to figure out the translations. But without this y by a half, you could be guessing and checking for a long time before you find something that works nicely. So this strategy of looking at the horizontal distances and the vertical distances is really helpful. We can now, as far as where things are at, we can now, step 5, actually write the equation. The equation, in terms of f, you need to multiply by a half. That will be outside the function. Oh, I'm going to just change this equation because they wanted us to write, let's reread the question. They want us to write the equation for the image graph in terms of the function f. You would have 2 options for the image graph. The image graph is the blue one. You could either write y equals, but I would like it even better because we know the image graph is g of x, to write g of x equals. In terms of the function f, means that f needs to be on the right-hand side of our equation. So we would have 1/2 f bracket. We have no horizontal things, but we're going to the left. So to the left would show up inside the bracket as x plus 2. The 4 down happens outside the function, -4. So I think those purple numbers are important for you when you're studying this later, so that you realize, okay, I have to do this horizontal and vertical distances first, because my setup doesn't let me figure that out. Once I figure that out, I can write above these first arrows what's happening, then calculate the middle points, which would then let me figure out left, right, up, and down, and I could write my equation based on what I see above those arrows. So we're working backwards, but it's a little bit complicated working backwards sometimes. Okay, question for practice on this one. Is number 9.